Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Sip and Talk. I'm Joe, and as always, I've got Sunny here with me.
Let's try and unpack this whole U.S.-China trade thing again. It feels like every time you look, there's a different story.
It really does.
Yeah.
Trying to follow it is, well, it's a full-time job almost. Contradictions everywhere.
Exactly. It's like trying to nail jelly to a wall, you know? So what we've done is sift through a whole bunch of recent reports, official statements, news analysis.
Right. Trying to get a clearer picture for you. We're looking at what U.S. officials are saying, what China's saying or not saying, and how other countries are reacting to.
Yeah, think of this as like your deep dive briefing. We'll cut through some of the noise. We looked at statements from Trump, China's foreign ministry, financial news like Bloomberg.
And also checked out what folks in Singapore, Vietnam, India, South Korea, Thailand are making of it all. The goal is really just to understand what seems to be happening now.
Okay, let's get into it. The biggest, I guess, head scratcher is just, are they talking or not? You had Treasury Secretary Mnuchin saying pretty clearly, look, these high tariffs, they're not sustainable.
Right. He basically said they will be negotiated down. That sounds like progress, or at least an intention towards it.
It does. But then almost in the next breath, you hear President Trump saying, well, yeah, tariffs will decrease, but definitely not to zero. And he's also called them a complete victory.
Which is confusing, right? How can it be a complete victory that you also need to dismantle, even partially? The messaging isn't exactly consistent.
Not at all. And then there's that claim he made to Time magazine. Said Xi Jinping called him, their teams were talking constantly, and agreement was basically done.
Yes, that was a very specific claim.
But then China just flat out denied it. Their foreign ministry was like, nope, no talks happening, you're misrepresenting things.
Very direct denial. They accused the U.S. of basically making it up. So you've got this stark he said, she said on a massive international scale.
So what's going on there? Is it just posturing for their own audiences back home?
That's almost certainly part of it, yeah. Both sides have domestic audiences, international allies, rivals.
Mm-hmm.
They're playing a complex game. The public statements might be just one part of the strategy.
Okay, so if China's publicly saying no talks, how do we explain them putting out these tariff exclusion lists for some U.S. goods? That seems counterintuitive.
That's a really key point.
Yeah.
It does seem contradictory. Despite saying no negotiations, they announce exemptions for specific things like aircraft, crucial lithography equipment for making chips, radar.
Right, stuff they probably need anyway.
Exactly. It could be partly pragmatic, easing pressure on their own industries that rely on those imports. But it's hard not to see it as a signal, too.
Mm-hmm.
Like a subtle communication happening even without formal meetings.
So actions speaking louder than words, maybe? A kind of backdoor communication channel?
Potentially, yes. It allows flexibility without publicly backing down from the no-talks stance. It keeps options open.
Interesting. Are there other sort of under-the-radar signs suggesting things might be happening?
Well, there was the visit by the People's Bank of China Governor Peng Gongsheng to the U.S. for the G20 meetings. His comments there about China's economic policies might have been partly aimed at, reassuring or communicating with the U.S. side.
Okay. And didn't they swap out their main trade negotiator with the U.S.?
They did. Wang Shouwen was replaced by Li Changgang. And there was some speculation, just speculation, mind you, that this might have been something the U.S. wanted someone seen as having, perhaps more direct access to the top leadership in Beijing.
Like trying to get someone on the phone who can actually make a decision.
Something like that, yeah. Streamlining the communication, potentially.
Okay, going back to that alleged Xi-Trump phone call. Trump says yes, China says nothing. What's the theory there?
Bloomberg had an interesting report on this. They suggested maybe the call didn't happen because certain correct conditions weren't met from China's perspective.
Correct conditions. Sounds very diplomatic. What kind of conditions are we talking about?
According to Bloomberg sources, it could be things like the U.S. needing to show more, quote, respect, be more consistent in its positions, and maybe address China's concerns on things like sanctions, or, importantly, Taiwan.
Okay. So maybe the conditions weren't right for that high-level chat yet. Lots of maybes.
A lot of reading between the lines, definitely.
So that's the top-level confusion. Let's zoom out a bit. How are other countries reacting to all this back and forth? What about Singapore?
Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong has talked about needing, measured responses in trade wars. Don't overreact, basically.
And wasn't there something slightly unusual with his wife sharing an article critical of Xi?
Yes. Ho Ching sharing that article certainly got attention. Some analysis suggested it could be a subtle signal, maybe reflecting views within Singapore or even hinting at internal Chinese dynamics. It's hard to say for sure, but it was noted.
And Singapore's also tightening controls on tech exports, right? Semiconductors, AI.
They are, which fits into the broader picture of countries adjusting to the U.S.-China tech rivalry and supply chain concerns.
Okay, over to Vietnam. The analysis said they're feeling anxiety. Why specifically?
Well, Vietnam's economy is heavily trade-dependent, so this uncertainty hits them hard. Plus, they're worried about Chinese goods being sneakily rerouted through Vietnam to dodge U.S. tariffs.
Right, they don't want to get caught in the crossfire or penalized for that.
Exactly. So they're cracking down on checking the origin of goods. And there are also these reports, maybe worrying for Vietnam, that Samsung might shift some investment away from them toward India.
Ooh, okay. So Vietnam's trying to manage the risk. Are they talking to the U.S.?
Definitely. They seem to be actively engaging, reportedly offering to buy things like Boeing planes and U.S. natural gas, likely trying to, improve relations and address the trade balance.
It makes sense. Now, India, the analysis uses the word satisfaction. That's quite different from anxiety.
It is. India seems to see the situation as potentially an opportunity. Reports suggest their own trade talks with the U.S. are going, well, Vice President Pence visited, they've got a framework.
And potentially buying U.S. military tech, too, like the F-35.
That's been mentioned, yeah. Suggests a potentially deepening strategic relationship alongside the economic one.
So, kind of benefiting from the U.S.-China friction, perhaps, what about allies like South Korea?
The U.S. Treasury Secretary actually praised South Korea's approach, their game in the negotiations. Seems positive. They're apparently moving into more detailed technical talks now.
Okay. And Thailand. Also worried about goods being rerouted.
Seems so. Like Vietnam, they've mentioned increasing scrutiny on the origin of exports heading to the U.S. It shows how widespread the concern about tariff evasion is.
It really paints a picture, doesn't it? Everyone trying to navigate this. Okay, let's pivot back. We talked about China's potential flexibility signals. What about the U.S. side? Any more assertive moves recently?
Oh, definitely. The analysis highlighted a pretty significant moment at the UN Security Council. The U.S. reportedly, for the first time, came out with strong vocal support for Taiwan's participation in international bodies.
Wow, okay. That's usually a very sensitive line.
It is. And they specifically criticized China's interpretation of UN Resolution 2758, arguing it doesn't actually settle Taiwan's status or prevent its involvement globally.
What else came up at the UN? Just Taiwan?
No. The U.S. also hit on familiar themes criticizing China's trade practices, like alleged intellectual property theft, market access restrictions, dumping, framing the U.S. tariffs as a response to all that.
And the South China Sea.
That too. Criticized China's actions, explicitly supported the Philippines, and called on China to respect the 2016 international ruling, which Beijing rejects. So a very broad and firm pushback.
Okay, so the U.S. is keeping the pressure on multiple fronts. Meanwhile, back in China, are there signs of more concrete concessions coming, beyond just those exclusions?
Yes. There are reports suggesting China is actively considering suspending some of its retaliatory tariffs, specifically the 12.5% ones on certain U.S. imports.
Why now?
The analysis suggests it's because the trade war is genuinely hurting their economy. The costs are adding up, apparently.
Interesting. What kind of goods are we talking about potentially getting tariff relief?
The lists mention things like some medical devices, toys, certain industrial chemicals. Aircraft leasing was also mentioned as a possibility.
And semiconductors, weren't they specifically mentioned?
Reuters reported that yes. 8 semiconductor-related products were supposedly on the list for exemptions. And another list was circulating with like 131 categories, vaccines, chemicals, engines, potentially worth around $45 billion in imports.
So potentially quite significant relief if it happens. And wasn't there something about Shenzhen import data?
That's right. Some data reportedly coming out of Shenzhen institutions seem to show that China might have already quietly removed retaliatory tariffs on some U.S. items, specifically mentioning chips and semiconductors again.
So maybe some targeted easing is already happening under the radar.
It certainly looks that way, particularly in key tech areas. Maybe not a full rollback, but a strategic easing.
Okay. Now, the analysis we reviewed also dove into some alleged economic difficulties within China itself. What were the main points there?
Well, one huge point was the claim that Apple has decided to move its entire supply chain out of China, shifting iPhone production to India. If true, that would be massive.
Absolutely massive. Apple is so intertwined with Chinese manufacturing. What else?
It also mentioned Huawei facing headwinds in Europe. bribery allegations, the EU Commission apparently refusing to meet their lobbyists, suggests growing resistance to Chinese tech firms internationally.
So the argument is that these external pressures, plus maybe the tariffs really biting, are forcing China's hand towards these quieter negotiations and exemptions.
That's the core argument presented in the analysis, yes, that the economic pain is becoming a major driver of policy.
The analysis also brought up some quite dramatic claims based on online videos about China's internal situation. We should probably stress these are claims from analysis of online content, right?
Absolutely. It's crucial to note the source. But the analysis did reference these videos that allegedly show, cities like Shanghai and Shenzhen and even smaller towns looking much emptier than expected. Significant population decreases were alleged.
And based on that, the analysis questioned official population figures.
Yes, it used these anecdotal video reports to raise doubts about the official numbers. Again, interpreting online content is tricky, but that was part of the analysis.
And it wasn't just population, right? Something about shops and restaurants.
Correct. The analysis pointed to reported declines in catering and retail sectors, suggesting consumer spending is down. Even accounting for more home delivery, the numbers reportedly didn't add up, raising questions about overall economic health.
And this ghost city idea in the Greater Bay Area.
Yeah, the analysis described seeing lots of vacant apartments and for rent signs in that major economic zone, again using it to question the official narrative of booming growth and population figures.
So putting it all together, this particular analysis paints a picture of China facing significant economic challenges, both external and internal, which might be pushing them towards being more flexible on trade, even if they don't admit it publicly.
That's the interpretation offered, yes, that the internal economic reality is a powerful, if unspoken, factor in their current trade posture.
Wow. Okay. So pulling back from all the details, what are the big takeaways here?
For me, it's really that huge gap between the public talk and the potential behind-the-scenes actions or signals from both the U.S. and China. Also, just how much this ripples outward, seeing how countries like Vietnam, India, Singapore are all adjusting their strategies.
Yeah, the global reaction is fascinating.
And finally, this question mark over China's internal economy. If that analysis about economic headwinds is even partly right, it could really explain some of the flexibility signals we're seeing, like the tariff exemptions.
Definitely. And it leaves you wondering, doesn't it? Like, what are the real reasons behind the conflicting official statements? Are these tariff exclusions just temporary fixes, or will they lead to something bigger?
And what does this all mean geopolitically? Are we seeing permanent shifts in supply chains and alliances?
And crucially, how accurate is that picture of China's internal economy? Because if it is facing major difficulties, that changes the whole negotiation dynamic, right?
Absolutely. These are the big questions. And honestly, there are no easy answers right now. But keeping track of these developments is so important, whether you're in business or just trying to understand, the global economy.
Totally. It impacts so much. So maybe a final thought for everyone listening. Given all this uncertainty, the conflicting signals, the potential economic shifts, could we be looking at the start of a really fundamental change in how the world economy is structured? Maybe a whole new order emerging from this friction?
That's a deep question, something to definitely keep mulling over.
Indeed. We'll keep tracking it.
I just want to give another shout out to Micky from Mickytolife. His channel is a treasure trove of inspiration, and he's a huge Sip&Talk fan.
Absolutely. Make sure to check him out and maybe even share your awesome podcast intro with him once you've created it. All right, everyone, welcome back. So this is part 2 of our deep dive.
Yeah, picking up right where we left off.
If you were with us earlier, we were really wrestling with the whole latest tariff situation. Man, that was something.
It really was. A lot of twists and turns. And, going through all of that, something kind of kept popping into my head, and maybe you felt this too listening.
What's that?
It's this feeling that, sometimes what's being said publicly, coming out of China and what actually seems to be happening, they don't always quite line up.
Totally. It's a bit of a head scratcher sometimes.
Exactly. And that's really what we want to try and unpack now.
Yeah, like we talked about with the tariffs, right? You had Treasury Secretary Mnuchin saying pretty clearly, look, tariffs aren't sustainable. We got to negotiate.
Plain as day.
Then, bam, the president comes out, says tariffs are this huge victory, even claims, like President Xi called him, they struck a deal.
But then the details get fuzzy.
Right. And then, wait for it, the Chinese Foreign Ministry steps up and says, nope, no tariff talks happened. What?
Makes your head spin.
It really does. You just want to throw your hands up. So today, we're diving into why. Why does this perception exist? This whole saying one thing, doing another idea.
We'll look at some, real-world examples, maybe circle back to those tariffs a bit too, and just try to get a clearer picture.
And why should you care? Well,
yeah, I mean, this isn't just some abstract theory, right? Understanding this dynamic, it actually gives you a real leg up.
How so?
Well, for understanding how things work in Chinese society, how business gets done, even how international relations play out. I mean, in today's world, that's pretty valuable info to have.
Okay, let's do it. Let's get into this whole saying one thing, doing another puzzle. Where does this even come from? Our sources point to some, pretty interesting cultural factors, like way back.
Yeah, starting with Confucianism. It puts this huge emphasis on harmony, this idea of he, wei, gi.
Harmony is precious.
Exactly. And also on face, yanzi.
Okay, face. We hear that a lot, but what does it mean practically?
Well, it often leads to communication that isn't always direct. Keeping relationships smooth, avoiding public embarrassment that becomes really, really important.
Ah, okay. So what's said on the surface might not be the full story underneath.
Precisely. It's like, okay, remember that study our sources mentioned? The one comparing Chinese and American university students?
Vaguely, yeah. What about it?
It found the Chinese students were much more likely to use these, indirect strategies. Praising someone before disagreeing.
Oh, softening the blow.
Yeah, or saying thank you, or even kind of agreeing at first, before actually bringing up their different point of view.
It's like that classic example, right? Your friend wears something wild.
Uh-huh.
And instead of, whoa, what is that? You go with, wow, that's certainly a choice.
Haha, exactly. You're being polite, preserving face, theirs, and maybe yours too. You're not lying, but you're not being brutally direct either.
So it's about navigating social stuff carefully. Makes sense. Especially that idea of verbal commitments maybe having some built-in flex.
Right, like an enthusiastic yes to plans might mean yes unless something unavoidable comes up, just to avoid a potentially awkward no later. It protects the relationship.
Okay, I get that. But if you're from a culture that's super direct, that could definitely cause confusion.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. But it's not just these deep cultural roots, is it? The political system, historical stuff that plays a big role too.
Right. Our sources talked about how the political system, with its emphasis on official narratives and controlling speech.
Yeah, that can lead to what you might call a double discourse.
Yeah.
People kind of learn to say what's expected publicly, what fits the official line.
Well, maybe thinking something different privately, almost like self-protection.
Exactly. Especially when you consider history. Think about periods like the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah, our sources mention that. That must have taught people to be incredibly careful about what they said.
Absolutely. Prioritize survival. Prioritize fitting in publicly, even if it means conforming outwardly. That kind of caution with words can have a long shadow.
You can see how that habit might stick around.
And then you layer on today's world. Intense competition, socially, economically.
Right, and those unofficial rules you mentioned, hibex, kangize.
Yeah, the unspoken ways things really get done sometimes beneath the official surface.
The secret playbook?
Kind of. And in that environment, maybe seeming inconsistent isn't always seen as a negative. It could be like an adaptive strategy.
How so?
Well, if you feel the formal rules are unreliable, or they change suddenly, or aren't applied fairly, then navigating through these unofficial channels, maybe saying one thing officially while doing what's necessary unofficially, becomes a way to survive, even thrive.
Okay, like the example of a company publicly championing environmental rules.
While maybe quietly finding ways around them to save costs, or an institution claiming total fairness in evaluations, but maybe informal connections still play a role behind the scenes.
It sounds like it could breed a bit of cynicism about the formal systems.
It potentially could, yeah. Leading people and businesses to find their own ways, which might look inconsistent from the outside.
And it's not just big systems, right? What about just individual habits?
That too. Our sources touched on psychology. In cultures that emphasize the group, sometimes individual expression gets a bit suppressed,
Oh, rock the boat.
Exactly. So you develop these social skills, presenting a certain image for harmony, for acceptance. And over time, these patterns saying the expected thing, maybe acting slightly differently, can just become normalized.
Like it just becomes how things are done, passed down almost.
Yeah, maybe even to generations who didn't directly experience the original pressures. It's fascinatingly complex.
Okay, so we've explored some of the potential whys, Let's dig into those real-world examples now. And it's interesting, like you said, how it loops right back to the tariffs.
It really does. So remember Mnuchin saying negotiations were needed?
Yeah.
Contrast that with the president's completely different take. Huge win, Xi called, deal done. But then, when pressed, super vague about the actual call.
Right. Total opposite messages. And then you get the Chinese Foreign Ministry just flat out denying any tariff talks even happened.
A direct contradiction. You're left thinking, okay, what's the real story?
Exactly.
But then, get this, if you look closer, like our sources did, China started releasing lists of tariff exemptions not long after.
Ah, okay. So action speaks louder than words.
It strongly suggests some kind of communication, some negotiation likely did happen behind the scenes, despite the official denial.
So a clear case of saying one thing, no talks, while the action suggests something else was going on.
A pretty textbook example of that perception, yeah.
Wow. Okay. But it's not just trade wars, right? This pattern shows up elsewhere.
Seems so. Our sources brought up human rights as another area.
How does it play out there?
Well, you often see official reports highlighting progress on human rights. But at the same time, there can be significant restrictions placed on international observers who want to come in and verify things independently. Or think about the cancellation of those bilateral human rights talks with the U.S.
So it's like saying, we're improving, but also don't look too closely.
That's one interpretation, yeah. It creates a disconnect between the stated commitment and, let's say, the openness to scrutiny.
Got it. And then COVID-19 management came up too.
Right. Remember the declaration of a decisive victory early on.
I do.
But then later, we saw major outbreaks in places like Jilin and especially Shanghai. That raised questions about the initial declaration and maybe the accuracy of the data being shared.
And wasn't there some initial hesitation about the WHO investigation into the origins?
There was, yeah. A perceived reluctance to fully cooperate, which seemed kind of at odds with public statements about supporting international collaboration on health. Again, that potential gap.
And even on a more basic level, like food supplies during those lockdowns.
Exactly. Sources mentioned official claims of sufficient supplies, running alongside reports and social media posts from people in lockdown saying they were struggling to get food. What's said versus what's experienced.
Man. And this extends even to, like, the UN international stage stuff.
Apparently so. There was that instance mentioned where the U.S. representative criticized China's interpretation of a specific UN resolution, UNGA Tiny 758, regarding Taiwan.
So differing interpretations leading to different actions on the world stage?
Yeah, highlighting how the same words can be framed and acted upon very differently, leading to friction.
It's like everyone's reading from slightly different scripts. What about the business world? That seems like fertile ground for this.
Oh, absolutely. The whole integrity first slogan you hear a lot. Businesses emphasize trust. But in practice, sometimes success might rely more on, let's say, less transparent methods, maybe bending the truth in advertising or heavily relying on guangxi, those personal connections.
Relationships matter more than the rules sometimes.
That can be the perception, yeah. Examples like maybe overhyped real estate ads or exaggerated claims in live stream shopping, those came up.
And that tech company example, Smartisan.
Right, Shanzikeji.
Yeah.
They had this really bold advertising promising amazing things.
That the products didn't quite deliver on.
Didn't always live up to the hype, yeah. Which, understandably, created some trust issues down the line.
Okay, wow. So we've covered a lot of ground here. Cultural roots, political context, social pressures, even just habit.
Yeah.
And seen examples from trade talks to tech companies. What's the big takeaway then? How do we wrap our heads around this?
Well, I think the main thing is it's complex.
Oh.
Really complex. It's not some simple judgment about a whole country or people.
Definitely not. Avoid stereotypes.
Exactly. And our sources did stress that things are evolving. Younger generations, more open urban centers, you're seeing shifts, maybe towards more directness, more emphasis on sincerity. It's not static.
That's important context. So it's not everyone, everywhere, all the time.
Not at all. But understanding these potential dynamics, these underlying currents, that's still super valuable.
Why? For the listener, why does this matter?
Because if you're engaging with China, whether it's in international relations, doing business, or even just trying to understand the news, having this awareness gives you a more, let's say, nuanced lens.
Helps you read between the lines a bit.
Precisely. It encourages you to look beyond just the surface statements, to consider the actions, the context, the potential unspoken factors, to be a bit more critical in a constructive way.
Okay. That makes sense. Look deeper.
Yeah. And maybe here's a final thought to chew on, something we didn't fully dive into. How much does a focus on long-term strategy, maybe prioritizing long-term goals over immediate transparency? How much does that play into these perceived inconsistencies on the world stage?
Ooh, that's a good one. Flexibility for the long game versus upfront clarity now. Definitely something to mull over.
Yeah.
Well, this has certainly been a deep dive. A lot to think about.
Sure.
Hey, listen. Before we officially wrap up today, I got to give a quick shout out.
Right.
Yeah, to our old friend Micky. He's got this YouTube channel. Seriously, you guys should check it out. It's called Mickytolife.
Micky. Yeah, he's great.
Isn't he? It's just fun. If you want some genuine laughs, some really cool, kind of down-to-earth observations about everyday stuff, you have to look him up.
He's got a knack for finding the funny side of things.
Totally. We've known him forever. And seriously, his videos are just a blast. Always entertaining. So yeah, search Mickytolife on YouTube. Give his channel a look. You won't regret it.
Good recommendation. Might even see a familiar face pop up there occasionally.
You never know. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for diving deep with us again.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We'll catch you next time.